Dirk Van Zyl, Glenelly Wine Farm, Wine Estate. It's such a pleasure to have you here. Today we are under the influence of your wine, of you, and also of vintage and exploring four beautiful vintages, but very different vintages of the Lady May. But before we get stuck into that, I'd love to... I actually don't know much about your sketchy past.
Hopefully it's not too sketchy.
But you were potentially going to actually be lost to the South African wine industry and making wine in the States. What was your journey?
No, not completely. Thanks firstly for having me. It's great to be back on Belfield. I think now 8 years later. So actually my journey started in Bonneville. So I grew up on a small little family wine farm there. My dad farmed about 35 hectares. And
vineyard.
Of vineyard and our own little cellar. So my great grandfather built a cellar in 1940. And obviously, more bulk wine production. My dad went to study in Stellenbosch in the 70s. And went to the farm in 1983. And then my grandfather and his brother actually were farming together. There were two separate farms. And so my dad started making wine, and in 1994 started bottling under the Van Zyl label. So very small, but that was the booming days of everything opening up. So business was quite easy.
And so went from like this to this.
Yes, I think my dad had this story of he went to London Wine Trade Fair in 1994, and there were like 16 South African producers at the fair. So pretty easy pickings. And so I grew up with that. I remember as a small little kid, my mom always had to phone down to the cellar in harvest time to find out if she could bring me down. If it was a crazy day in the cellar, I wasn't allowed there because my dad would be running around too much. But if it was a pretty easy day, then I would spend my afternoons in the cellar and sitting on the tractor tipping and all of that.
Much as what your son is doing now.
Exactly. So it's really like quite a nice full circle at the moment for me, with my son on the farm in Glenelly. And so yeah, I mean, there's never been anything other than wine, I think. With that, that sounds very simple, but there's a lot of evolution into how I look at wine and what it was back then and what it is now. But yeah, so grew up on the farm, went to study in Stellenbosch and fell in love with Stellenbosch and met my wife there as well. Initially, the idea was always to go back to the family farm. And so my first few years in the industry was very much focused on and when I was studying was very much focused on, what can I do on the farm? I only studied the things that I thought I could implement on the farm.
I mean, ironically, Bonneville, it's sort of like the white label producer for quite a few high-priced red wines.
It's very not a lot of it gets advertised necessarily, but there's a lot of decent wine being made
wine,
there. So that started there. Went to straight out of varsity. Got very lucky. I did my internship at Glenelly, and so straight out of varsity, 2 days after my final exam, I started full time at Glenelly. So my journey was a bit different to most winemakers, where a lot of guys goes to harvest 3 or 4 or 5 different vintages at like 3 or 4 different spots. I went straight into a permanent job, and I was very lucky in that generally when you start quite young in the industry, you get stuck into doing all the work guys like me don't want to do anymore, like all the schleppy admin work. And I was very lucky in that I was appointed as assistant winemaker, but I was actually almost their viticulturist for all their outside growers. So I had about 30 growers throughout the Western Cape.
These farms
and so I think my first vintage there, I drove about 13,000 kilometers. And so I was, I had vineyards up in the West Coast, a lot in Darling, Durbanville, Stellenbosch, the back of Paarl, even some in Elgin, some in Stanford, and I would be on these vineyards, every 2 weeks to 4 weeks in each of these vineyards, and it was really to merge. How do we let the viticulture and the winemaking speak to each other? And what do we, if we see something in the cellar, a shortcoming in the cellar, how do we fix? Because we all know, there's only so much you can do in the cellar. How do we, get it right in the vineyard? And so I was quite lucky in that my first 5 or 6 years in the industry was very much spent in the vineyard.
I think that's with
that link, with the link to the wine. So that I was very fortunate. Then I moved to De Morganson with Carl van der Merwe when Carl was still there. before he left to Canada. I joke and say he went because I went, but that's very much not the truth. But so, and that was a nice shift, because obviously De Morganson is quite different to the business, the styles of wines, the approach to winemaking is very different. And so did a few years at De Morganson, and then was at Saxenberg. And wasn't yet, planning on moving. I think there was a lot of, exciting stuff happening at Saxenberg for me. But then, Luke left from Glenelly to go to Vergelegen, and Glenelly has always been one of those places. Since I was at a tasting once when I was at De Morganson, Carl was part of the Cape Winemakers Guild, and he had his tasting for the Cape Winemakers Guild was a vertical of Pichon Lalande. And it was hosted in the Glenelly cellar with Madame, and I sat across the table from her the first time I properly met her, and I remember I sat there for an hour probably listening to her talking about 4 or 5 vintages of Pichon, and I was just if you're not inspired by that, your soul is pretty dead. Yes. And so Glenelly has always been that, and so when the opportunity opened up, you can't not take it. And so it's been a little bit more than a year and a half now at Glenelly, and it's a really exciting journey. I must say, it's very exciting.
It's amazing. I don't think we've really tasted too many of the wines that you've made yet. Because when did you go across?
In 23, end of 22.
22,
so
okay. So
September 22.
We're looking forward to that.
So the wonderful 23 vintage is my first vintage.
Wow, yeah, that's a baptism by fire.
Yeah, on a Bordeaux-style property in Simonsburg.
Sort of like those Bordeaux vintages of old, where it just rained for 3 weeks. Yeah. But I think it's also really interesting to hear that background of, because I sometimes tease winemakers, they're like rock stars, but you, before you could, take the microphone, you went and learned all the other instruments in the different vineyards, and you really appreciate the origin of, what comes into the glass is really the origins in the berries and the terroir, and then also the way it doesn't just happen by chance or by nature. There's human intervention. So you getting to know the farmers, convincing them to maybe try a different style of pruning or cover crops or
and to drop fruit sometimes.
Which and then you're paying a farmer, in the Achterpaal per ton.
The incentive is not there to drop fruit.
So that must have been, what were your main lessons in that sort of time around viticulture?
I think having. It was very much a baptism of fire. I remember in my first week I started, Johan Hubert was still the cellar master back then, and we drove to various farms and we bought a lot of old vine Chenin from Leeuwenkuil, and we were with their team in the vineyards, and I was this straight out of varsity 22-year-old, and we were standing in the vineyards, and Koos was like, what do you think we need to do here? And this bush vine back of Paul, I've never touched a bush vine in my life. And so you have to think on the fly. And unfortunately, I was suckering a little bit doing this, and he's like, oh yeah, that's what I thought as well. I was like, oh, thank goodness. But I think getting that exposure to completely different takes and working with guys that have, been farming for 30 or 40 years and guys that are quite young and have taken out over family farms, and seeing that progression into the winery, so seeing, listen, if we break leaves on this is actually the result, and there's a lot of satisfaction in that, and in working with a vineyard where you're like, geez, this is such a special site, but we're just not, you can feel you're not tapping into it, and then in 3 or 4 years time you're tasting the wine, you're like, oh my word, this, we got it, and so I think just and understanding that every site has something that works for it. Someone asked me last night again as well, what is my, what varieties really make me excited? And I'm almost hesitant to say it because it sounds maybe a bit generic or a bit of a cop-out, but I like whatever works on the farm, kind of thing. And so when I was at De Morganson, Chenin and Chardonnay is it just works. It really, it's so simple. and you can make so many different expressions of it. On Saxonburg it was Syrah, and on Glenelly it's Bordeaux varieties. You know, and so understanding, you know, what each site gives you, and how to interpret that and how to take that into a bottle of wine, that's quite exciting.
But that also, you kind of need to, especially as a young gun, you need to kind of remove your ego in a way. Like really listen to, because if a site, it makes a great pinotage and you don't want to be a pinotage winemaker.
Then but I think, you know, you have to, as a winemaker, you have to very much remove your ego about it, and then also, you know, just be open to not what your preconceived idea about this is. And you know, when people ask, you know, stylistically, what do you like to make and all of that, I think you must always be as close to what you see the most natural interpretation of the site is. And even with that, you have to put the caveat in there. You know, nowadays we all like to say, minimal intervention and stuff. We all intervene. You have to intervene. There is an interpretation. You know, you can put 5 fantastic winemakers on the same site. They're going to make different wines, and it doesn't mean either all 5 of the wines can speak of the terroir, but in different ways. And so you have to be open to that. And play it a bit as you see it, I guess. But that's, you know, that's the fun and exciting part. You know, it's like wine is that perfect blend of science and art. And both parts can be equally exciting.
And I think that, you know, that word terroir, you know, Ibn Sadi always said when we chatted about it, everyone talks about soil and climate, but there's a human hand. And you can't remove traditions of a certain place that, you know, how do we do things in you know, a certain part of the world, and then how is that reflected back? Because South Africans, we love to travel and pick things up and bring them home.
And if you think about, you know, in all the places where, you know, wine is an ingrained part of the culture, food goes hand in hand with the wines that are made in that area. Everything is interweaved. You can't take one component out of it. And I think sometimes maybe where we were, we wanted to copy what other parts of the world were doing. And so you extract one portion of that and try and copy it here, and that will inevitably you're always a copy. You're never the true thing. And I think where we are now as an industry, we're moving more into a place where, you know, it's becoming more intertwined with everything we do.
And it's happened quickly. I mean, if we think about the wines that we drank 15 years ago in South Africa, it's a completely different space.
It's like just from, I mean, I started studying in 2009. And just in that short space of time, it has been absolutely incredible, the progression of how the industry has changed, and also how open the industry has gotten. You know, if you 15, 20 years ago, you could, if you tasted a nice bottle of wine, chances are if you phoned the winemaker, he probably wouldn't tell you where the vineyards were if it wasn't an estate vineyard, because he bought it somewhere and he would be worried that you're going to buy, you know, steal his grapes. 4,000 rand a ton. Yeah, exactly. And now, I mean, now it's celebrated where the vineyards are. No one's shy about it. It's all open book. And you can phone, you know, pretty much any winemaker in the country and say, geez, I drank this bottle of wine of yours. It's fantastic. What did you do? And he'll probably tell you every single thing you did to that, you know, in the whole process. And that's fantastic. And that, I think, really, puts us as a South African wine industry in quite good stead, is that there is that collaboration now coming into it, and where, you know, rising tide lifts all boats kind of thing, where it's not I'm not competing against my neighbor. If my neighbor does better, I do better. And I think we're finally starting to realize that.
It's and that's how new regions get discovered or rediscovered, you know, like there's, you know, this sort of collaboration now around like the Ceres Plateau and those more continental wines, and
some exciting stuff.
It's amazing, and you know, that's so necessary, is that collaborative effect, because if it's just one producer with one secret vineyard, that vineyard probably won't get replanted because there's not, the commercials aren't there, and, and it fades away.
No, definitely.
Awesome, Dirk. So I think I'd love to dive into the story of Glenelly, and maybe we should do it with some wine in the glass.
That always helps.
Because I for me, it's always been sort of like a mystery wrapped in an enigma, because it's such an incredible piece of terroir. And then there's the sort of origins, you know, in terms of the mystery and grace and elegance of your proprietor,
Yes.
in terms of that pedigree of Bordeaux. So yeah, maybe we should get the 2016
Cool.
and 2017 in the glass.
Pour them.
I'll pour 2016.
I'll do 17.
So we'll go 2016 on the left.
Yeah.
Okay. This is very good.
Two.
Well done. Sorry, Yannick,
Yeah.
you must just have your coffee there, buddy. So how did Glenelly come to be? Because I just have this recollection of, spending a lot of time at Rustenburg, fantastic
Yes.
producer, and not knowing anything about Glenelly.
Yeah.
And then suddenly Glenelly felt like it was like on the map.
Yeah.
And I mean,
it's in wine terms, it's an incredibly short story or short lifespan.
with a long origin.
Like Nick joked the other day. So Madame's grandson, who took over as CEO end of 2019 and lives on the farm full time, said the other day, there's this quote where they say, first 250 years of wine farming is difficult, but fortunately they've done that already.
Yeah,
so
tick that box.
So
drain the swamp in Bordeaux.
Exactly. So Glenelly was a fruit farm up until 2003.
Okay.
It was basically just plums, a bit of apples and pears and stuff, but just fruit. I think there's been vineyards interspersed in the life of Glenelly, but never really an essential part of it. And so Madame got introduced to South African wine predominantly when she was the president of the IWSC in London, and she sponsored the Best Blended Red Wine Trophy, which is, I think, quite a progressive thing for a Bordelais producer to do. Saying, listen, there are other wines than Bordeaux in the world that can be great.
It's the most progressive stance I've ever heard.
And so she sponsored that, and part of if you won the Pichon Lalande Trophy, you got invited to Pichon in Harvest to spend a week with them. And so in that time that she was the president, South Africa won it more than any other country, and so she got to know quite a few of the winemakers and started traveling to South Africa a little bit and fell in love with the culture, and realized that obviously there's massive potential here. And so in 2003 she almost before that had something in America as well, which fortunately didn't work out. She had this conversation with me the other night. Sorry, I'm going on a bit of a tangent, but she had this conversation with me the other night. She's like, she always fights with the Americans because they incessantly refer to it as a wine industry. And she's like, but an industry creates cars and things, wine is living. It's not an industry. But so she came to South Africa and was looking for something small. Well, in her words, she said something small because I was 78 years old. And so I didn't want to take on a big project. And so she was looking for like 20, maybe 30 hectare farms, plug and play situations, more or less. And then soon realized that, a lot of the vineyards were riddled with leaf roll. The wrong varieties were planted. And so she thought, she might as well, it's better to start on a clean slate. So that's how she got into Glenelly. And she drove onto the farm, saw the slopes. Saw the slopes and saw the soils, and just fell in love with it. And so bought 120 odd hectare farm with not a single vineyard on it, and without a winery. And she was 78 years old. And so immediately after she bought the farm, they started pulling out the trees, and in 2004 started planting vineyards. So most of our vineyards were planted between 2004 and 2006. We've got about just under 60 hectares planted on the vine. We've got some olives and stuff. And then in 2008 built the cellar, which is, if you've ever been in the cellar, is quite a state-of-the-art building. And that is just incredible for me to think that she was 83 when she was heading that project. That is like one of a kind building in South Africa when she was 83 years old.
When most people are, aiming for a sort of world cruise, setting up a winery. Because my folks did that sort of in the 60s and 70s, and it's a proper job.
It's a proper job, and so first vintage of Lady May was 2008. And so the story is really quite short, but I think in a short time span, Glenelly has managed to build up quite a good following and quite a good reputation.
Yeah.
And the terroir is definitely, Madame and her drive and all of that, but also just the site is just incredible.
Area just produces stunning
and for me,
wines.
if you taste those first few vintages, the vineyard they were all super young vines. The crew was all brand new. No one really had worked with the site before, so everything was counting against them. You can taste those first few vintages, and it's there. It's the wines are holding up incredibly well. They're showing beautifully, and that just speaks to terroir. That at the end of the day does trump everything.
Yeah.
If you don't have that, then you're a little bit lost. But so it's been it's a relatively short journey, but a very exciting one. And I think what's very nice about Glenelly is that the farm has been was established with one sole purpose, and that was to produce this wine. The rest and I'd say that not to discount the rest of the
building
wines,
blocks. Yeah.
But Glenelly was founded by Madame to make a top-end Bordeaux style wine in South Africa, and that makes it a little bit easier as a business to know this is what we work on.
Yeah.
And so we're starting replanting now, which is very exciting. And the first question is always, how does this affect Lady May?
Yeah.
How can we? And working for the Bordelais, they don't get excited about 5,000 bottles of something. It can be the best 5,000 bottles in the world, but 5,000 bottles.
That's what blows my mind about the first growths. You in a barrel cellar with 2,000 barrels of a first growth.
Yeah.
And
it all goes into the first wine.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so so that's the goal with Lady May, is how do we really optimize the vineyards on the farm, and how do we drill down into the finite detail in what we do in the cellar, so that predominantly of most of what we produce can go eventually into Lady May. That has to be the goal. With that comes a lot of, you need to sell it as well.
Yes.
Which is, I think, almost the tougher part than making the wine.
I'll send the team a quick WhatsApp to make sure that they're doing their job.
Yes, thanks. I'd appreciate that. But yeah, and it's a wonderful journey. It really is.
Fantastic. So yeah, let's let the wine speak to us.
Yeah.
So thank you so much. This is incredibly special to drink 4 vintages of Lady May with you. And I think it's going to be really interesting to discuss it in the context of what was happening in the Cape Winelands climate, a little bit about your terroir, your soil, and then also to kind of understand maybe a little bit of the influence of that sort of Bordelais influence, in terms of Coopers, or I don't know. It'd be interesting. So let's dive into
2016. So I brought these 4 vintages because I think for a long time, I think especially in the 90s and maybe the early 2000s, in the rest of the world, South Africa was almost seen as if there was no vintage variation, where it's like the sun always shines in the Cape, so they're all within this very narrow band. And the nice thing about top end of wine, at the premium side of wine, is vintage variation is something to be embraced. And I think we sometimes almost want to distill it down into good vintages and bad vintages, and I think we take a lot away from the beauty of wine from that. There are fantastic vintages, but there are vintages that are maybe seen as lesser vintages, but offers a lot of beauty at certain points in its life.
I find for me, a lot of the good vintages show beautifully quite early on. And then some of the cooler, we've got a whole bunch of old Belfield here, and
that
very
was undrinkable in their youth.
Yeah, very I think it was 2013 or maybe it was 2014. It was a very cool, difficult
2014
year.
Was a wet and
and it's just absolutely
vintage.
Singing now. So
and that's the incredible. I know Madame also spoke about the shadow vintages in Bordeaux, where you had the great vintages in Bordeaux, and there was always a vintage after that wasn't rated straight after vintage or during en primeur. But 10, 15, 20 years down the line, everyone gets so excited about the shadow vintage. It's not you could pick it up for a comparative bargain, but the wine just shows well. So I think, these 4 vintages shows that variation effect. Obviously, 3 of the vintages being drought years, 16, 17, and 18. And then 19 is, breaking the drought. So it's a nice progression. We're releasing 19 pretty soon as well. So we're always quite late on releasing Lady May. We're quite traditional in that sense. But 16, 16 came after the like highly rated 15 vintage. So it's a bit of a forgotten vintage almost just by pure fact for that. And it was a difficult one because it was super dry. We had the 2014 vintage that was very wet. So a good winter leading into the 15 vintage. And then 15 was very dry throughout the vintage, which made it a lovely vintage.
Similar to this year, actually.
Yeah. Made it quite an easy vintage to handle. And then 16 came. We had very little rain in winter, and it was super dry in summer with a lot of heat.
Yeah.
And so it's a stressful vintage. And in those vintages, it's very difficult to capture the finesse and the precision, and the wines can be quite easily quite flabby and a bit showy. But what I like about the 16 vintage is, yes, keep your 15s probably a bit longer, keep your 17s a bit longer, but the 16s for me is at a good space to drink now. About 8 years from vintage, I think it's in a really, and if you smell this, there's a beautiful approachability to the wine now. It's there's a nice openness to it without it being on the back end of it's not falling down by any means. But there's beautiful fruit, and it's nice and open. Where if you just smell the 17 in comparison to that, the 17 is still it's still closed.
Oh, wow. Very closed, eh? Yeah. And sort of like darker fruits or something. Yeah.
Much more intensity. It's like, I always say, like the 17 is like a guy dressed in a tux with a bow tie. Some point, somewhere that bow tie is going to come off and he's going to loosen his top button, and it's going to be...
it's like a South African wedding with a tie around the head.
Exactly. And but where 16 is just, offers all of that enjoyment now. So even though 16 wasn't this massively rated vintage, it's still, it speaks to Glenelly, it speaks to the vintage, and that I think first and foremost as a winemaker, what you have to keep in mind is that wine always needs to show time and place. Because it's the only thing. What other thing in the world can you drink 60 years on and it can take you back to if it was done well? You can drink something from the 1960s. And consume it, and it can still take you back to that vintage, and the technologies that were around and all of that. So you have to be, you have to show that, and so I think 16 captures that, that warmness of the vintage, the drought. So there's a concentration to it, but there's a ripeness to the fruit without it being overripe. And those tannins are just starting to soften quite nicely. But there's a lovely approachability to the wine.
I find the tannin in 2016 a bit more, like a bit chunkier.
So generally that's from the warmer vintage. You get that slightly chunkier tannin. The tannin isn't as knitted as what it would be in 17. So they're sitting apart a little bit more. But it shows it so nicely. And then if you go to 17, 17... I always joke and say that the only bad thing about the 17 vintage is that it was only 2 years after 15, because we all got so excited about 15, and then 17 came around and we were like, oh well, this is actually maybe better, and I think most people have come to realize that 17 is probably the better vintage, but 17 was continuation of the drought, but quite a cool vintage and very cool nights, and so there was heat in the second half. Look, for cab, you need a bit of warmth. And so it wasn't a cold vintage. There was enough heat around, but it wasn't. You didn't have these heat spikes going up to 40 degrees, which can be quite detrimental. And so you preserved a lot of fruit, a lot of freshness. The wines have all this intensity from being quite a dry vintage. But just everything knits in, seamlessly.
This is beautiful. Hey? I mean, they're both beautiful wines, but you can sort of see that elegance and refinement in the 2017.
You can, it's a bit more classical.
Exactly.
But both of these offer, straight. They've got their different strengths.
Yeah, now that we've had kids, you can't say that you have a favorite, They're just
exactly
different. So that you mentioned that daytime, nighttime temperature difference. I think a lot of when you talk about climate, that's something that I think people don't really quite understand. Is you often talk about like, is it a hot climate? but the reality is like you can have a more moderate difference in day and night near the coast. But then if you're in Robertson, it can get flipping cold. Yeah. So what influence does that like hot day, cool night have on ripening? And
so that always, you know, and I'm no expert in this, so, so take whatever I say with a pinch of salt. But, you know, in general, I think if you've got that cooler nights, it's almost gives a bit of a respite to the vines. You've got a cooler start to the mornings. And generally in those vintages, you see you're holding on to acidity a bit better. The vineyards stay in shape a little bit longer. But in Stellenbosch, you know, we must be careful shouting about diurnal shifts too much, because on the other side, we say, you know, ocean influence, and the ocean is only there, and we get all these cooling breezes. So in the one breath we're saying, our afternoons are not as hot because we've got the ocean, and then we want to say there's a big shift to the night. No, you can say that in Robertson, definitely, you know. And that for me, I remember my
Bonnievale.
Exactly. My first few years in Stellenbosch, that for me was quite striking, because in Bonnievale, if the sun sets, it cools down. Every night, doesn't matter, it could be 40 degrees in the day, it will be cool at night. And then you come into Stellenbosch some nights and you're like 9 o'clock and you're still sweating. And so, but obviously within that there is differences in vintages, and some vintages have cooler nights, and you can always see that in ripening for me. And we saw that this year in 2024 as well, where in March, end of February and March, the night started cooling down, and you can see that slowing down of ripening in the vineyards, where, you know, things were tracking quite quickly, or sugars were rising quite quickly, and then you just almost see this plateau where things are staying stationary much longer. And like in a vintage of like 2019, which we'll taste, which had some rain in the vintage as well, and then very cool nights after that rain, everything just went like dead still for like 3 weeks. I think on Glenelly there was a 3-week gap in harvest because you had some rain, so you had to wait for the water to get out, and then after that, you know, the nights were cool, the soils were a bit damp, and so everything just plateaued for this time. So what can happen in those times is you get still phenolic ripeness happening, but your sugars are staying quite low, and then it gets quite exciting, because you get full ripe wines without, you know, 15.5 alcohols,
without that heat on the palate.
Exactly.
And because 2024 we had a lot of rain last year, 2023, so would you say it's sort of like, and then very dry, but not too hot?
No, not too.
So would you say it's
warm,
sort of
warm, but not a lot of heat spikes? We had some heat in January. End of December and January, we had some big heat, and it was so funny for me because I was actually on a trip to Kenya, and I was sitting on we were in Nyanyuki, and my wife was sending me WhatsApps like, "Oh, it's 38 degrees in Stellenbosch," and I'm like, "Well, I'm on the equator and it's 26."
Yeah, you're at altitude on the equator.
And so 24 is a very exciting.
You must be excited about it.
It's you know, touch wood. It's the most excited I've been about a vintage after a vintage. We made a few bold calls this year as well, which seems to have come off. We hope, because this year I've got a fantastic assistant winemaker, Leandri, and we had this chat earlier in vintage where, you know, we all like saying, you know, we pick on flavor and taste and what the vineyard looks like, but we so often get persuaded by analysis and into a different direction, or we lose our nerve. And this year I just decided, you know what, more often than not, I've regretted losing my nerve and not backing myself. And so this year we started early on with the Chardonnays already. We were like, we're going to taste it. If it tastes right, irrespective of what the analysis says, we're picking it.
It was one of those years,
And so on average, we picked a lot of things a lot earlier. Like we had our Cabernet Franc. We picked, you know, we did some sugar samples, and the last week or two we didn't do any. We would just went into the vineyard every morning and tasted. We made the call. Super happy with where the grapes were. We picked it and came into the cellar at like 23.4 Balling, which for Simonsberg Cab Franc is quite low, and people will say, oh, and you know, the thing about Glenelly is we've got this big southeast facing slope, so quite a cool slope,
very cool slope,
and so everyone would be like, oh, it's going to be green, and so like, you know what, we made the call. This is going to be right. Obviously, like 3 or 4 days into ferment, Cab Franc goes into this like quite a green phase during ferment.
And you're like, oh no.
And I'm like, oh, I remember we were tasting for extraction, and I was looking at Leanne, and I was like, oh, this is a problem. But then fortunately a week later it came out of that, and now the wines, you've got a wine with an alcohol of 13.6, but all the power of a dry vintage, but none of it is alcoholic power, which is really exciting. And what was another thing that was quite interesting about the 24 vintage, we had such thick skins, and our juice to skin ratio was so much on the skin side that we literally did about 50% of the extraction we would normally do at much cooler temperatures. So most people ferment reds at 26 to 28 degrees. Our ferments was for 80% of ferment at 22 degrees Celsius, with half of the extraction than what we would normally do. And because I remember we had Merlot, and like 2 days on the skins, it hadn't even started fermenting, and it was this color.
Wow.
And you already tasted the tannin, and I was like, well, we're done.
Ready to, So then you just press.
So I mean, you keep it on, but we did this like very, very gentle extract.
Oh, okay, so you're not doing as many pump overs
as many, and the pump overs would be shorter, because you still need to keep the cap healthy. But the other reason why I like fermenting quite cold is that your cap health is much better. If you ferment at 26, your cap can go to 30 degrees Celsius. And you can get a lot of stuff happening in there. So, but if you ferment at 22, your cap is maybe at 24 or 25 at a max, and so you don't need to do pump overs for temperature regulation. And so that gives you a bit of another thing, which was weird that we did this year. We sometimes just did circulations, but under the cap. So we would splash the cap a bit and then do so we still wanted to introduce oxygen into the ferment. So you would do an open pump over, but just rack it back into the bottom of the tank. So just did a circulation to keep and not.
But I've noticed this in your winemaking. The wines I've tasted, you do aim for this elegance and and freshness in red wine for me. So underrated.
I think for me, if obviously we're not trying to copy Bordeaux, but you have to look at inspirations. And if you all the great Bordeaux wines I've tasted, there's a common thread if you want to like distill it down to one single thing for me, and everyone's going to look at it slightly differently. But for me, there's an effortless to the tannin in Bordeaux, where we often work it, and if you drink a serious wine, it's serious because it tells you it's serious.
Strip the enamel off your teeth.
But if you drink like first growth from a great vintage first growth Bordeaux, it doesn't scream at you. No. It doesn't punch your face out. It's got power. It's got bucketloads of power, but it's a subtle power.
It's that old saying, "Iron fist in a velvet glove."
Exactly. And so for me, on Glenelly, what was which is quite interesting, having worked 2022, a few vintages in the Polka Dry, and then moving to the Simonsberg, tannins vastly different. Yeah. They're literally the opposite sides of the coin, and so. And Polka Dry, you have much softer tannins. The tannins generally sit a bit broader on the palate. In Simonsberg, we've got this like it can be quite brutal. Cabernet on Glenelly, 2 weeks before harvest, you eat 3 or 4 berries and your mouth is parched. You could eat a whole bunch in the Polka Dry and you'd be fine. And so for me, it's very much not about how do we extract, but how do we keep the tannins fine and elegant and subtle. Yeah. Because we're going to have enough tannin. Yeah. Like generally, I'm not too worried about that. So how do we keep it fine? And so my whole, I get very nitty gritty into how do we keep tannins fine, and so we focus a lot on that during ferment, and that's where I found cooler fermentations, adjusting your extraction on the go. We often write out a pump over schedule for the guys, and they're like halfway into it on a tank, and we're like, no, stop. Yeah, this is extracting too much, or and so there's a lot of making decisions on the fly. And
in a cooler year, would you want to do more?
Perhaps,
depending on if it's astringent tannins.
Yeah, exactly. It all depends. And Madame always reminds me. She's like, remember, it's not about the quantity of tannins; it's the quality of tannins. And so and so you can also, if you don't have, like in 2023, where we had a lot of rain, all of March was was wet. There's no point in chasing big wines in 2023 because you can extract, but what you're going to extract is quite harsh and more seed tannin than anything else, and so you have to be led by that as well, and that comes into reflecting the time. Reflect the vintage. If there's no point making big concentrated wines in 2023 because that doesn't speak to the vintage. And so 2024 it goes about how do we have all this concentration but still maintain beauty and elegance in the same time, because she's a lady.
Yes, exactly.
So
and I think that's for me like really exciting about Lady Man. What you're doing is, because I've been very lucky to drink a fair amount of Bordeaux, and we've got this little project on the farm working with David Trafford.
Yeah, it's exciting stuff.
It's really cool to sort of see a lot of the red wines coming out with that that sort of elegance, and not to say that like a sometimes like a massive cab. It's like a comfort blanket, like on a cold winter's
evening.
night, and there's beautiful expressions of that, from California, but I do think that globally there's also this interest to creating wines with more finesse.
Exactly,
alcohol.
and I think just chasing that for the fact of it being a trend is not the right way to go about it, because we all know that by the time that we release that wine, the trend's passed, and
It's
we're
so true.
behind. But I think there's a lot more. Like, what is the truthful expression of the sites, and how do we get to that, and most often it is not the work, picked very ripe, hard work. It's also on the flip side of that, the move to like super light style reds is also not always the answer.
Exactly, like a carbonic red is
because you lose terroir, you lose sight on both sets of the spectrum. To express sight, you need ripe fruit. Not overripe fruit. Sometimes ripeness, when you say, ripe fruit, people mistook that for, picking at 26 or 27 bulling and very ripe stuff. That's overripe fruit. That's not what you want. But if you pick too early, it's also not ripe. And that's why this year I literally, we decided we're not going to look at sugar analysis. We're not going to look at the analysis even. And so literally the last 3 or 4 weeks of harvest, I didn't do a single grape sample.
Amazing.
We knew.
The lab phoning you, like, hey, where's our business?
So we had done enough, and we knew the cabs were, getting close to a point where, they were all above 22 barreling or around about there. And I said to Leanne, we can do it, but why, actually, if you think about it, why are we doing it? Because if we taste it and it's ripe and it comes and it's tested 23 barreling, let's pick it. If it's ripe, it's ripe. We complain about struggling with high alcohols, and then we look to gift horse in the mouth. But on the flip side of that coin is, if it's green, it's not ripe, and the analysis is at 24.5 or 25, then we can't pick it yet because it's not ripe yet. And so we were fortunate in 2024 that most of the stuff came in and were quite low relatively low in sugar, so we've got nice alcohol balances. Will there be a vintage where we might have higher alcohols again because the vintage just took longer? You've got lots of sugar ripeness and not a lot of phenolic ripeness. Yes, we'll probably have that, and that will be another set of challenges. And but you got to just trust it at the end of the day, and play it as you see it.
It's super exciting. Should we crack on to 2018, 2019? It's also, I think, something that I've so a complete layman, but something that I've noticed is you can get that real balance in years where there's like a consistency in the vintage in terms of like climate. So if you have a stop-start vintage, where it's like heat spikes, rain, up and down the vine, lots of wind, the vine actually kind of goes into like a dormant state and then pops up again, and that's where it gets quite tricky sometimes, because the sugar ripeness can kind of run ahead of the phenolics.
No, definitely. But also in those, the key remains, is spend a lot of time in your vineyards.
That's what you learned at the beginning, eh?
Exactly. Spend a lot of time in your vineyards. Taste as much as you can, as often as you can, and don't be set on what was worked in the past, or have this rhythm. Oftentimes farms, you have this rhythm of, I know I pick this block and then I pick this block and then I pick this block, and that's a dangerous thing to get in, because you that always sits in the back of your mind. You're like, oh, but this must be next. And then you have vintages like that where with even on Glenelly, there's massive soil differences on the two different slopes. They react differently to weather patterns, and so if there's rainfall, one block will dry out much quicker than another block, and so that can throw around everything massively. and the only way that is by just walking in the vineyard and tasting and looking how the grapes are reacting.
And you live on the farm,
and I live on the farm.
So you walk the dogs, the kids.
Yeah,
and that's brilliant.
Yeah, that makes a big difference. It really does help a whole lot.
Fantastic. So we've got 2018 and 2019.
Yes, 18 and 19. So 18 is what we've currently got in the market. Now 18 is obviously at the back end of the drought. This is where Cape Town was like 2 weeks away from running out of water, and so a very concentrated vintage. The tricky thing in 18 was very much controlling that power, because it was quite easy in 18 to make wines that are over the top, very much old school,
rustic
red wines, that lose a lot of finesse and a lot of precision.
And were the vines actually bearing less fruit? Were they actually struggling?
It was quite a small crop as well. And so a tricky vintage in that sense. The fortunate, I think, the saving grace for 18 was that we didn't have the heat spikes that 16 had. So it wasn't as hot as 16.
Okay.
But you can taste, comparatively, there's a plushness to 18 that you don't have in 17. A beautiful, and it's always interesting when you pour these wines. If you have 20 people around a table, everyone will have a different, order of which vintage they prefer, just stylistically on what you like.
Sort of really, it coats every sort of layer of the mouth, with like that. It's got an amazing mouthfeel.
So there's a beautiful blushness. It's a bit wider on the palate. There's this beautiful like dark purple fruit to it. Lots of power. And then when you compare that to 19, so 19 was it's all interesting always, looking back a few years later, where I remember in the 19 vintage, it was quite a tricky vintage. Because of the rain in the second half of the vintage, and so especially for late ripening stuff. And now 19 is getting quite good reviews, a few years down the line, for the elegance of 19,
very elegant,
lower alcohols. And so I think, I must say, I'm very, very excited about this 19.
Wow, it's much more focused.
Super focused. There's a precision to it that is just incredible.
It's almost got like a steeliness to it, this wine will, I think, could age really beautifully. It's fascinating. Is
that line of acidity that runs through the middle of your palate, just pulls it straight to the back. And obviously differences in blend percentages and all of that.
So what is in the, typically what's the makeup of the blend?
Typically between 70 and 90% Cabernet Sauvignon. So always heavy,
left bank style,
very left bank style. Then percentages of Cabernet Franc, Merlot and Petit Verdot. 17 was the only vintage with no Merlot in. And so, but I'm generally quite terrible at remembering the percentages because, we don't really look at.
No.
I always find it so interesting when oftentimes in tasting rooms, like the tasting room staff has this, they can remember all of
But it's a classic question.
It's like,
what is the percentage blend? What percentage new oak?
I've had it.
It's like a cheat card for asking questions at a tasting room.
When I was in my first year at Glenelly, I was working in the tasting room over December, and I remember there's someone coming in and they tasted I think it was like Vineyard Selection Chenin or something. It's barrel fermented Chenin, and this guy was like, this wine would have been it's good, but it would have been brilliant if you took it out of oak 1 month earlier.
Thanks,
Thank
pal.
you. We'll note that next time.
That's proper backseat driving there.
and then like obscure blend. Oh, if you added 1% more of this, it would. And so we don't really look at the blends of the varieties as much. It goes much more about how do you reflect the farm in that vintage. And so, but it's generally it works out that cab is always the dominant variety. In a vintage like 23, cab is going to be much smaller than what it was in 2017. It was 90% cab.
Yeah.
I think our base blend of 23 that we've worked on, we're looking at I think a max of about 60% cab, almost under that, because it was such a difficult vintage for cab with all the rain in March.
The cab was hanging in there.
The Merlot and the Cab Francs were
celebrating Easter.
Yeah, exactly. And so the Merlots and Cab Francs were brings all the structure and power in 23, where the cab then plays a different role. And I remember after the vintage as well. So I have a phone call every Tuesday morning with Madame, and she's been in the country now for 2.5 months, which has been incredible. She's turning 99 in a month from now.
Unbelievable.
Literally, yeah, in a month from now. And so every Tuesday morning I have a call with her, and I remember after I said, a vintage like 23 shows you why Bordeaux does blends.
Yeah.
Because in a difficult vintage,
it's like an insurance policy.
You need that.
Crop insurance.
And she at a lunch one time, she was saying, she's grown up loving blends, and she believes, that's where the real art in it is. The excitement is, working with all these varieties and how they express and putting them together, and then you're really showcasing the vintage through all these different varieties. And she was like, as an aside, she was like, we're not like the folk in Burgundy. They just put everything in a bottle. They don't care. And so,
Burgundians take that very seriously.
Yes. And so, but I mean, two equally valid but opposite philosophies. And that was something I think I learned quite early on in my career. I remember after my first vintage at Glenelly, there was obviously things that my dad taught me about making wine and how he approaches it, and then you work at a different winery for the first time, and you're like, this is the opposite of what my dad always said. And I remember getting back to the farm, and I'm like, how do I put these together? Because I've got all these like separate ideas now, but how do I mix them into one? It's like, making wine is a lot like raising kids. He's like, if one family, one set of parents believe if your kid is naughty, the only way to handle it is to give him a smack every now and then, and the other one would say the worst thing in the world, you're going to ruin your kid if you ever give them a pat on the bum. And he's 20 years down the line, you're not necessarily going to know.
And you have to end up doing it your way.
He's like, so the only way to do it is to know why you're doing it.
Yes.
Do it for the right reasons, and follow that. Like, don't be wishy-washy about it.
Yes.
No, this is why I'm doing it, what I'm doing, and how I'm doing it, and then you'll be okay.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic advice for winemaking and parenting.
It's a lot of both. I think is equal parts, just like figuring it out along the way.
Yeah, jeez, Dirk. Well, I mean, this has been really, really fascinating. I think what would you say is the golden thread through the Lady May? Is it the fruit, the tannin? Because the variation is there for sure, and I've got my favorites, but it's there is that golden thread for me.
Yeah, I think, and it'll be interesting to hear what you think the golden thread is. I think we always there's this wine will always be powerful.
Yeah,
there's always power, and there's this our logo represents actually quite nicely what we try and achieve with this wine, where the rhino is power, the lady riding side saddle is elegance, and people often think those are two separate ideas in wine, but really it's all, if you can have both of these, and that's balance, and that's the glass on top of a hand in the logo, and that's what I think this is there's equal parts power and elegance. And so that balance and balance is everything, tannin, acid, fruit, structure, all of that has to be there. And I think for me that is what we that's the guiding light almost, is always have this play between power and elegance.
I think that's a very, very good summary. And I think, for me, the 2016 and 2018, for me, reflect more the power side of things. And then 2017 and 2019 have that sort of off the cap, maybe more to the elegant. And I just think that balance between the two is just incredible. And I'm really excited to taste many more of these Lady Mays with you and with friends and family over the coming years, and also to see how your fingerprint, because it is a light touch. That's what I like about your winemaking. It will also impact these wines, Dirk. Well done, man.
No, thank you so much. I think someone asked me just after I started, like, what do you want to? What's your idea of where do you want to take it stylistically? And I said, I think the most successful I can be is if you can't notice my winemaking in it. And so that's really the guiding light. But it's always it's great. We make wines to share wines and to tell stories. And that's what you guys do so flippin' well. I think better than a lot of people is telling is trying to tell our stories. So thank you for that, and always a pleasure to share a few special bottles of wine.
Well, great wines are all about people and place and experiences. And I think you enjoyed a Lady May with a Kenyan raised beef fillet in Nairobi, and that's just another incredible way to experience your wines is on the African continent.
Fantastic. No, definitely.
Awesome.
Thank you so much.
Cheers, man. Thank you.